Brandon froze as the sleek black sedan rolled to a stop outside his failing garage, its windows tinted, its chrome gleaming like it didn't belong in a place like Maple Hollow. Two men in tailored suits stepped out, one holding a silver briefcase, the other calling his name with eerie precision. He had no idea that fixing a stranger's broken water tank would lead to this moment, standing on the edge of a life he never saw coming. A heat wave had swallowed Maple Hollow whole. The kind of sticky, relentless August heat that shimmered off blacktop and made everything feel slower, heavier, older. Brandon Tate stood beside the open hood of a beat-up Ford Ranger, the sweat pouring down his back soaking through his dark gray work shirt. His garage, Tate's Auto and Tire, sat at the edge of town like an old dog too tired to bark. The sign creaked in the wind, one corner sagging on a bent screw. Inside, the single fan spun lazily, doing nothing to ease the sweltering air. Brandon, 42, wiry with silver strands beginning to pepper his temple, wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag and gave the engine one last look. Another quick fix. Another small invoice he wasn't sure the customer would pay on time. He closed the hood, exhaled, and looked across the empty lot. No more cars waiting. No phones ringing. No walk-ins. The garage felt more like a tomb these days. His mortgage payment was overdue, the bank had stopped calling, and his checking account had been sitting under double digits for a week now. Still, he hadn't missed a day of work. Not because he thought the customers would come back, but because showing up was all he had left. He was locking up the side door when he heard the voice. Soft. Trembling. "Excuse me, sir?" He turned. A petite elderly woman stood at the edge of the sidewalk, her wide-brimmed straw hat casting shade over delicate features etched with time. She wore a long, faded floral sweater despite the heat, clutching a worn leather purse to her chest. Her eyes, light gray, sharp and steady, met his. I hate to trouble you. But my water tank's given out. I don't know much about these things and, well, I don't have anyone else." Brandon blinked. His stomach rumbled, he hadn't eaten since a stale honey bun at sunrise. A half-finished carburetor still waited back inside. And honestly, all he wanted was to collapse on his sofa and pretend the world didn't exist. But something about her voice, her vulnerability, tugged at him. "It's probably nothing," she added quickly. "Just a leak, maybe. I could call a plumber," but she trailed off. He saw it in her face, plumbers cost money. Money she didn't have. Brandon sighed and offered a tired, crooked smile. "Show me where it's at, ma'am." Her face lit up. "Thank you. Truly. I live just down Maple Street, past the diner. It's not far." He nodded and followed her. They walked in silence past peeling storefronts, rusted mailboxes, and yards browned by sun. A part of him wondered why he said yes. But deep down, he already knew. His mama had raised him to show up for folks, no matter how hard things were. Her house was a small, weathered structure tucked behind a leaning fence, shaded by an ancient oak tree. Paint peeled from the wood siding. A rocking chair sat crooked on the porch. She led him around back, and there it was, a rusted water tank, slumped to one side like it had just given up. Water had pooled in the dirt, attracting dragonflies and the faint smell of mildew. Brandon crouched immediately, brushing away vines and leaves. The valves were nearly rusted shut. One seal had split clean in two. He got to work without a word. For 2 full hours, he toiled in the sun. His shirt clung to his back, hands slick with oil and sweat. The woman, who finally introduced herself as Mrs. Dorothy Lanier, brought him a lukewarm glass of sweet tea halfway through, apologizing that her fridge barely worked anymore. He thanked her with a nod but didn't stop working. His head throbbed. His arms ached. But something inside him, something that hadn't stirred in a while, kept him going. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the simple truth that helping her felt more real than anything he'd done all week. As the sun dipped lower, Brandon finally tightened the last bolt and stood up, wiping his face on his sleeve. "All right, Ms. Lanier," he said. Give it a try. She turned the handle on the nearby spigot. A crisp, steady stream of water shot out, clean and strong, catching the golden light like a miracle. Dorothy gasped. Then, unexpectedly, tears welled in her eyes. "Oh my," she whispered, covering her mouth. "You fixed it. You really fixed it." Brandon gave a small, humble shrug. "Wasn't too bad. Just needed someone to get under the hood, so to speak." She stepped closer, fumbling in her purse. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," he said immediately, raising his hand. "Just glad I could help. But, really, no charge. I've got enough grease under my nails for one day." She stared at him for a moment, like she was trying to memorize his face. Then she nodded slowly. "You're a good man, Mr. Tate. Brandon Tate." "Thank you, Mr. Tate. You didn't have to, but you did. And I won't forget it." He gave her a polite tip of the cap and headed back up the street, his boots dragging. He didn't expect anything from her. He never did things expecting payback. That wasn't how he was raised. That night, he sat alone in his trailer, a can of chili warming on the stove, and thought of her words. "I won't forget it." Probably something people say in the moment, he figured. Just manners. But the next morning, something strange happened. As he approached his shop, a sleek black sedan idled out front. Tinted windows, polished chrome, license plate from Little Rock. It looked like a car that belonged in a business district, not outside a dusty roadside garage. Two men in tailored suits stepped out as Brandon slowed. One had a Bluetooth earpiece. The other held a slim briefcase and scanned the surroundings like he was casing a deal. Brandon immediately wiped his hands on his jeans. "Mr. Brandon Tate," the one with the earpiece asked. "Yeah? We represent Ms. Dorothy Lanier. She's requested a meeting with you." "Immediately." Brandon blinked. "Is she all right?" "She's perfectly fine," the man said, opening the back door of the car. "She's asked that we bring you to her personally. If you're available." Brandon hesitated. This had gone from small-town favor to something else entirely. He didn't know what to say. But curiosity won out. "All right," he said. "Just let me lock up." He tossed his wrench back on the workbench, flipped off the lights, and locked the door behind him. Then he climbed into the back of the sedan, the leather cool against his sweat-streaked arms. As the car pulled out of Maple Hollow and onto the main highway, Brandon stared out the window at the endless stretch of pine trees. Something in his gut told him that whatever was waiting on the other end of this drive was going to change everything. The leather seats were cool against Brandon's back as the black sedan cut through the morning fog rolling low across the Arkansas hills. He sat stiffly, hands clasped in his lap, eyes fixed on the road ahead though he couldn't see much beyond the tinted glass. The town of Maple Hollow had disappeared behind him minutes ago, its sagging rooftops and quiet storefronts swallowed by the trees. His mind spun like a loose tire bolt. Just yesterday he was elbow-deep in engine grease, patching up a neighbor's old truck and praying the electricity bill wouldn't bounce. Now, two sharply dressed men were driving him, some small-town mechanic with overdue bills and frayed jeans, out to meet the same elderly woman whose water tank he'd fixed for free. It didn't make sense. But nothing about the last 24 hours made sense. He glanced at the man seated across from him, the one who'd introduced himself as Mr. Granger, assistant to Ms. Dorothy Lanier. Granger hadn't said much since they left the shop, just that Ms. Lanier had requested Brandon's presence immediately. That she had business matters to discuss. Business. Brandon scoffed quietly under his breath. The only business he knew was brake pads and spark plugs. The tires hummed against the pavement as they turned off the highway and onto a private road lined with tall cedar trees. The scent of pine thickened in the air. It wasn't long before the canopy broke open into something that made Brandon sit up straight. Fields, endless fields. Rows of golden wheat swayed like waves in the morning light, and beyond them, neat hedges framed patches of blooming lavender, strawberries, and vines he couldn't even identify. It looked like something out of a magazine or a high-end farm-to-table ad. Not real life. Not his life. At the center of it all stood a sprawling estate, white stone columns, a wraparound porch, and ivy climbing up the sides like time itself had kissed every inch of it. A fountain gurgled quietly in front, and gardeners in neat uniforms clipped hedges with care. Brandon stared out the window, stunned. He hadn't known places like this even existed in Arkansas, let alone this close to Maple Hollow. The sedan rolled to a smooth stop at the base of the front steps. Granger opened the door for him. "She's waiting inside, Mr. Tate." Brandon stepped out slowly, boots crunching against the gravel. The heavy wooden doors opened before he could knock. A butler, yes, a real butler, gestured him in. The air inside was cool and smelled of lemon polish and fresh flowers. High ceilings, dark wood floors, and light pouring in from tall windows gave the place a quiet kind of grandeur. And there, standing at the end of the hallway, was Dorothy Lanier. But not the woman he'd met behind a broken water tank. No wide-brimmed hat. No faded sweater. Today, she wore a sleek beige pantsuit with a silk scarf tied neatly at the collar. Her white hair was pinned up elegantly, and a pair of diamond-studded earrings glinted in the light. She looked every bit the matriarch of an empire. Yet her smile, warm and familiar, hadn't changed a bit. "Mr. Tate," she greeted, walking toward him with surprising poise. "Thank you for coming." Brandon cleared his throat, trying to hide how out of place he felt. "Yes, ma'am." "You said it was important?" She nodded and motioned for him to follow. They walked together through a grand hallway, sunlight spilling onto the checkered floor, until they entered a wide sitting room with French doors that opened to a view of the entire valley. Acres upon acres of farmland stretched beyond, dotted with workers, equipment, and the hum of productivity. It was breathtaking. "Please," she said, gesturing to a pair of chairs near the window. "Sit." He did, gingerly, as if the seat might disappear under him. She poured them both iced tea from a glass pitcher and handed him a crystal tumbler. "I imagine you have questions," she began. "Quite a few," he said, watching her carefully. "Yesterday you were just someone needing a hand with a busted tank. Now, all this?" She smiled, not unkindly. "I'm sorry for the deception. I had my reasons." She sipped her tea. "You see, I founded this place, Lanier Harvest Company, almost 40 years ago. Just me, a dream, and a quarter-acre of strawberries. Now we supply organic produce to 6 states, and I employ over 80 full-time workers. But I've learned over the years that success, real success, depends not just on knowledge or education, but character. And character, Mr. Tate, is hard to find." Brandon stayed silent, trying to absorb the weight of her words. "I've grown tired of resumes with the right degrees but no backbone. I needed to know if someone out there would do the right thing when no one was looking. And you did." Brandon blinked. "So you set me up?" "Not quite," she said with a smirk. "The tank really was broken. But I could have called my estate manager. I didn't because I wanted to see how a stranger would respond. And you did more than show up. You didn't ask for payment. You didn't rush. You just helped." She leaned forward, her gray eyes sharp. "Which is why I'm offering you something real today. I want you to join my company, not as a mechanic, but as director of operations and field maintenance across all my properties." Brandon nearly dropped his glass. "I'm sorry, what?" "It's a full-time position," she continued, calm as ever. "Salary. Benefits. Housing provided. I want someone who understands grit. Who leads by example. And I believe that's you." "Ms. Lanier," Brandon began, shaking his head, I fix trucks. Change oil. I've never led a crew. I've never even stepped foot in a place like this till 20 minutes ago." "Exactly," she said. "You don't come with bad habits. You come with heart. And heart, Mr. Tate, is the one thing I can't train." He stared out the window at the valley. It felt like he was watching someone else's life unfold. A week ago, he was wondering if he could make it to the end of the month. Now he was being asked to oversee fields the size of small towns. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Why not one of your managers?" She didn't hesitate. Because they'd never kneel in the dirt for an old woman they didn't know. "And you did." The silence that followed was thick with possibility. Brandon's heart pounded in his chest. It didn't make sense, not by anything he'd been taught to believe about the world. But something about her offer, her trust, felt more real than anything he'd had in years. "All right," he said slowly. "I'll do it." A flicker of something, satisfaction, relief, crossed her face. "Good. I was hoping you'd say that. But," he added, rubbing the back of his neck, "you're going to have to show me the ropes. I don't know the first thing about farming on this scale." "Don't worry," she said with a gleam in her eye. "You're going to learn. And I'll be there every step of the way." As she rose to her feet and extended her hand, Brandon stood and shook it. Her grip was firm. Assured. The way someone shakes hands when they believe in what they're building. And as he looked out again at the land that would now be his to care for, he felt something stir in his chest, equal parts fear and excitement. This wasn't just a new job. It was a new life. One he never saw coming. The sun had barely crested the tree line the following morning when Brandon stepped out onto the front porch of his new cottage, coffee mug in hand, boots laced, and mind already racing. The cottage, nestled just west of the main Lanier estate, was modest but solid, 2 bedrooms, wood paneling, a screened-in porch, and windows that opened to the golden sea of wheat swaying with the breeze. He hadn't slept much the night before. After shaking hands with Dorothy Lanier in that sunlit sitting room, everything had moved quickly. Contracts drawn, keys handed over, and a whirlwind tour of the land he would now be helping to oversee. The weight of it was starting to settle in his bones. For the first time in years, he wasn't worried about the next paycheck, but instead about being enough. Could a small-town mechanic who used to patch radiator hoses now be trusted with an agricultural operation that stretched 8,000 acres, fed 5 states, and employed dozens of workers? That morning, Brandon wasn't sure. But he showed up anyway. By 6:30, he was walking the fields, clipboard in hand, escorted by a lean, wiry foreman named Miguel who had worked at Lanier Harvest longer than Brandon had been fixing cars. Miguel didn't say much at first, just nodded, walked briskly, and called out quick orders in both English and Spanish to workers tending the drip lines and soil monitors. Brandon kept pace, trying to take everything in. There were tractors fitted with GPS rigs, irrigation systems controlled from iPads, and greenhouses with sensors monitoring the precise growth patterns of every head of lettuce. This wasn't your granddad's farm. This was something else, something precise, intentional, and at times overwhelming. The learning curve hit him fast. The first few days were a blur of late-night manuals, early field inspections, and sitting through meetings with agronomists who talked in terms he'd never heard before. But Brandon listened. He asked questions. And when something broke down, a jammed seed spreader, a failing power line on the barn's roof, he rolled up his sleeves and fixed it himself. That, at least, was familiar. His hands still knew how to work. Still knew the rhythm of repair. But leading people? That was the real test. The crews, most of them longtime farmhands, watched him with quiet skepticism. They knew the land. They had been here through droughts, harvest booms, storms, and setbacks. Brandon was new. No one said it outright, but he could feel it in their eyes. Who's this guy? Where'd he come from? What does he know about our work? He didn't blame them. Hell, he'd ask the same if the roles were reversed. For a while, he kept his head down, showing up at 5 a.m. and not leaving until after dusk. He didn't bark orders. He asked what needed doing. He lent a hand when someone's axle jammed. He carried crates. Repaired leaks. Listened. Still, the turning point came on a blistering Thursday afternoon. The temperature had climbed past 95, and the crew was struggling to finish laying new drip lines before the weekend rain. The lines were tangled, the trench machine kept stalling, and tempers were flaring. Brandon jumped in, sleeves rolled, kneeling in the dirt beside a man named Luis Ramirez, a sharp-tongued veteran of the farm with 20 years under his belt. Brandon didn't say much. He just started untangling the line, sweat pouring down his neck, hands working fast. They finished the section an hour later. As Brandon stood to wipe his face, Luis handed him a water bottle and said, "You don't act like a boss. You act like one of us." The words hit him like a brick, but not in a painful way. In a way that felt like ground being broken for something new. From that moment, things changed. Slowly, respect grew, not through meetings or memos, but through shared labor. Workers started greeting him with nods instead of silence. Some even came to him with issues before going to the supervisors. Miguel invited him to join the weekly crew huddle. The changes weren't dramatic, but they were real. Day by day, Brandon was becoming more than just a hired hand. He was becoming part of the rhythm of the farm. Dorothy, true to her word, continued mentoring him. Every Tuesday, they met on the back patio of the estate, overlooking the lavender fields. She'd sip mint tea while reviewing crop reports and market forecasts. Brandon listened closely, asked questions, and absorbed everything. She challenged him constantly. "Don't just fix what's broken," she told him one day. "Find what's working and make it better." She pushed him to think like a steward, not just of equipment, but of people and land. Legacy isn't built on what you inherit. It's built on what you protect. And slowly, Brandon began to understand. The farm wasn't just rows of crops. It was an ecosystem. A community. A living, breathing operation where every decision, big or small, carried ripple effects. And he was now a keeper of that balance. The more he worked, the more his confidence grew, not because he had all the answers, but because he was willing to show up every single day and earn his place. One evening, as summer leaned toward fall, Brandon sat alone on the porch of his cottage, the fields bathed in golden light. The air was thick with the scent of wheat and cut grass. Cicadas hummed in the distance. He watched the crew finishing up near the lower rows, their laughter carrying through the twilight. He thought of his old garage, the peeling paint, the broken lift. He thought of those long nights wondering if he'd ever climb out of that slow decline. And he thought of Dorothy Lanier, who had seen something in him when he couldn't even see it in himself. He hadn't just found a job here. He'd found a purpose. And more than that, he'd found a future. He took a long sip of coffee, letting the silence settle around him. He thought of Maple Hollow, the people still there scraping by like he once had. Folks with calloused hands and good hearts, waiting for their own kind of break. He couldn't help but feel a tug in his chest, a promise forming quietly inside him. He wouldn't forget where he came from. One day, he'd bring what he'd learned back to them. One day, he'd build something there too. For now, though, the wheat swayed under the stars, and Brandon Tate, former grease monkey, current operations director, and future something more, sat steady in the night, ready for whatever came next. Because when someone sees your worth before you can see it yourself, it doesn't just change your life. It changes your story. And Brandon was finally ready to write a new one. Sometimes, life doesn't change in thunderclaps or headlines, it changes in quiet choices, made when no one's watching. Brandon Tate didn't have much. He was tired, broke, and running on empty. But he still showed up. Not for a paycheck, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. That one act of kindness, kneeling in the dirt to fix a stranger's broken water tank, turned out to be the door to a life he never imagined. The lesson here is simple, but powerful: character matters. It matters more than credentials. More than titles. More than your zip code or your past. Integrity shows itself in the smallest moments. And when you lead with heart, even when no one's looking, life has a way of honoring that. Dorothy Lanier didn't choose Brandon because he had a degree in agribusiness or because he had experience running an 8,000-acre farm. She chose him because he proved, through action, not words, that he was dependable, humble, and willing to serve. So here's my encouragement to you: never underestimate the power of small decisions made with big integrity. Keep showing up. Keep doing what's right, even when it's hard. Even when it feels like no one notices. Because someone just might. And if you're struggling right now, if you feel stuck, overlooked, or like the world has passed you by, remember this: your worth is not determined by where you start. It's defined by how you walk through what you're given. Brandon didn't just fix engines, he rebuilt hope, one bolt at a time. And when his opportunity came, he didn't shrink from it. He rose. To our listeners, thank you for taking the time to hear this story. If it moved you, if it reminded you of your own journey, or the kindness of someone in your life, please consider sharing it with someone who might need it. Your support helps us bring stories like Brandon's to light. Stories of justice. Of quiet triumphs. Of everyday people who carry extraordinary strength. From all of us here at Us Justice Stories, thank you for listening, for believing in goodness, and for being part of a community that values truth, dignity, and hope. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and remember, when you give the best of yourself, even when you have the least, that's when the world takes notice.